The Shadow King, the Midwest Marauder, the Southern Phantom, the Desert Reaper, the Pacific Kingpin, the Heartland Butcher, and the Northern Nightmare, 7 names that strike fear into every corner of the United States. Each ruled their territory with cunning, brutality, and a darkness that law enforcement could barely comprehend. But what if these deadly figures were not acting alone? What if a single force was pulling the strings behind the scenes, orchestrating a criminal empire larger and more terrifying than anyone could imagine? In the crowded streets of New York City, a young boy grew up in the shadows of towering buildings and abandoned alleyways. Life had offered him nothing but hardship, poverty, neglect, and the constant hum of danger. From an early age, he learned that survival meant being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than everyone else around him. He was small, quiet, and easily overlooked, which became his greatest weapon. While other children played in the streets, he watched, studied, and memorized the movements of those who controlled the underground. He began with petty thefts, stealing small amounts of money, food, and items that no one noticed were missing. Each minor success built his confidence and slowly earned him a reputation, first in the neighborhood, then across the city's forgotten quarters. By the time he reached his teenage years, his crimes had escalated. He moved from pickpocketing to orchestrating small robberies, always careful to leave no trace behind. The more audacious his acts became, the more he seemed untouchable. Rumors began to circulate stories of a ghostly figure who struck in the night and vanished without a sound. Local gangs noticed him, some trying to recruit him, others attempting to eliminate him. He learned quickly how to manipulate alliances, exploiting rivalries to his advantage. Violence was never his first tool. Strategy and foresight always came first. At just 25, he had built an empire. It began as a network of local gangs he controlled through loyalty, fear, or bribery, but soon expanded to include smuggling, illegal gambling, and even the infiltration of businesses and law enforcement. His name alone was enough to make rival gangs pause, to make witnesses hesitate, and to make policemen second-guess every decision. He had become a legend in the city, both feared and revered. Yet, what truly set him apart was his ability to disappear at the first sign of danger, leaving authorities frustrated and humiliated. Despite the violence and chaos surrounding him, there was a method to his madness. Each move he made was calculated, every ally and enemy carefully chosen. Some believed he had connections within the police department itself, whispers suggesting that he had men feeding him information from the inside. These rumors, true or false, made him even more untouchable. No arrest, no witness, no tip seemed capable of reaching him. And yet, his rise was not without cost. Each step up the ladder of crime brought him closer to enemies who were equally ruthless and patient. Even as he consolidated power, the city's skyline seemed to watch him, the towering buildings hiding silent observers who would one day challenge his dominance. But for now, he was the undisputed master of the night, a shadow moving among shadows, feared for his intelligence, respected for his ambition, and hated for his cruelty. His story was only beginning, and the darkness he commanded would stretch far beyond the alleys of New York, setting the stage for a criminal empire unlike any the country had ever seen. In the heart of Chicago, a different kind of menace was quietly taking shape. He was known to few, feared by many, and had earned the name the Midwest Marauder. Unlike the brazen violence of city street gangs, his methods were subtle, calculated, and deeply manipulative. He didn't rely on brute force to establish control. Instead, he built an empire that thrived in the shadows of legality, hiding his criminal activities behind layers of businesses, contracts, and seemingly legitimate investments. No one would suspect that the quiet owner of a small warehouse or a chain of convenience stores was orchestrating chaos across multiple states. He began his rise in the back rooms of bars and small offices, where deals were whispered and loyalties bought. At first, it was minor scams, money laundering for local gangs, discreetly moving cash and settling disputes behind closed doors. But as his confidence grew, so did his ambition. He realized that fear could be generated not just through violence, but through uncertainty and control. By quietly funding rival gangs and tipping them off about each other's plans, he created conflicts that allowed him to profit from both sides. Every confrontation, every skirmish in the streets, added to his wealth and expanded his influence. Unlike other criminals whose names were shouted in the streets, he remained a ghost, invisible to the public eye. He had a network of informants embedded in small towns and big cities alike, giving him intelligence about law enforcement movements, rival gang activity, and vulnerable targets. The Midwest Marauder's empire extended far beyond Chicago, reaching into neighboring states, where local authorities could only guess at the extent of his reach. Each move he made was deliberate, each investment a calculated risk designed to tighten his grip on the underground economy. Despite his careful approach, his growing power attracted attention. Investigators began to notice a pattern: unexplained conflicts between gangs, sudden surges in black market activity, and businesses inexplicably thriving while others collapsed. Slowly, pieces of a hidden puzzle started to emerge. A secret ledger was discovered, detailing thousands of transactions and secret arrangements. It revealed that the Marauders' influence had touched politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement alike. Every page painted a picture of a man who understood the delicate balance between fear, loyalty, and corruption, and used it to his advantage with deadly precision. Yet, what made him truly dangerous was his ability to stay ahead of everyone who tried to bring him down. Whenever authorities seemed close to uncovering his operations, a single tip or a misdirected investigation would cause them to stumble, leaving him untouched. He was a master of disguise, a planner of chaos, and a manipulator of people who underestimated his intelligence. By the time most realized the full scope of his empire, he had already moved to another level, his influence woven into the fabric of entire communities. The Midwest Marauder story was not one of violence alone, but of control, cunning, and patience. In Chicago and beyond, he had shown that power did not always roar. It could whisper, manipulate, and strike with precision. And while the streets might tell tales of gunfire and gang wars, the true force behind the chaos remained a ghostly figure, smiling quietly from the shadows, calculating his next move with unmatched skill and deadly intent. Deep in the bayous of Louisiana, a shadow moved silently through the night, leaving fear in its wake. Known as the Southern Phantom, he was nothing like the brash, loud criminals of the city. He thrived on subtlety, deception, and psychological manipulation. Unlike gangsters who relied on open violence to command respect, the Phantom's power came from making others believe they were constantly watched, that danger could strike at any moment, and that no one could be trusted. People spoke of him in hushed tones, never naming him aloud, fearing that the mere mention could summon his attention. He began his rise in the small towns along the Mississippi River, areas where law enforcement was sparse and rumors traveled faster than facts. He observed quietly, learning the routines of his targets, identifying weaknesses in rival gangs, and mapping the loyalties and fears of the community. By pitting small gangs against one another, he created chaos while extracting profit from both sides. He made his presence felt without ever appearing, leaving behind only subtle signs: a broken window, a missing shipment, a whispered warning. Each act reinforced his reputation as a man who could strike without being seen. Unlike others, he avoided direct confrontations, preferring to control through manipulation. He forged alliances with local business owners, corrupt officials, and even law enforcement, using bribes, blackmail, and deception to ensure loyalty. Every step was carefully orchestrated, every move designed to expand his influence without exposing himself. His victims often disappeared without a trace, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. Entire communities were paralyzed by fear, unsure if the man they whispered about was a myth or a terrifying reality. Despite the Phantom's careful planning, investigators slowly began to notice patterns. Missing shipments, unexplained disappearances, and gang conflicts all pointed back to a single orchestrator. When authorities attempted to confront him, they discovered he had cleverly disguised his operations under the guise of a legitimate shipping company. Trucks, warehouses, and employees all appeared lawful, but beneath the surface ran a network of smuggling, extortion, and intimidation. Even cameras meant to capture evidence often failed, as he anticipated surveillance and exploited blind spots with meticulous precision. What made the Southern Phantom particularly terrifying was his ability to vanish in plain sight. People who saw him on one day could swear they had been mistaken the next, yet subtle evidence always reminded them that he had been there. He could turn an entire town against itself, making neighbors suspicious of one another and leaving investigators frustrated and confused. His empire was built not on brute force, but on fear, intelligence, and the illusion that he was everywhere and nowhere at once. As his influence grew, the Phantom's legend spread far beyond Louisiana. Tales of his cunning reached distant states, inspiring both awe and terror. He became a master of psychological warfare, proving that the deadliest criminals were not always the loudest or the most violent, but those who controlled minds, manipulated fears, and turned ordinary people into instruments of their power. By the time anyone realized the full scale of his reach, it was too late. The Southern Phantom had already disappeared into the shadows, leaving communities to rebuild under the lingering weight of his invisible hand, and law enforcement to chase whispers that always seemed one step behind. In the scorching deserts of Arizona, a ruthless figure emerged, earning the name the Desert Reaper. Unlike the criminals of crowded cities, he thrived in the emptiness, using the harsh landscape to his advantage. The Reaper's reputation was built on fear and brutality, leaving an unmistakable signature wherever he struck. A small carved symbol, representing death, would appear at crime scenes, a chilling warning to anyone who dared cross him. He ruled smuggling routes that stretched across the southwestern border, moving drugs, weapons, and people with a precision that few could challenge. Every shipment, every deal, was a calculated move in a game only he fully understood. From the beginning, the Desert Reaper was relentless. He didn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened his empire. Small gangs and independent smugglers who tried to operate along his routes quickly learned the consequences of defiance. Violence was not random, it was surgical. Yet, he also had a strange sense of strategy. While others would react impulsively, he planned attacks months in advance, studying law enforcement patterns, surveillance, and rival networks. His ability to anticipate moves gave him a terrifying advantage, making him nearly impossible to trap. The Reaper's rise was marked by near impossible escapes. Time and again, authorities thought they had cornered him, only to find his trail vanished. A shooting that would have killed an ordinary man left him barely scratched, and he disappeared for years, as if swallowed by the desert itself. When he returned, his network had grown exponentially, now including accomplices across multiple states, extending even into Mexico. It was no longer just a local smuggling operation. It was a sprawling criminal empire with him at the center, untouchable and unpredictable. Despite his fearsome reputation, he was not reckless. He relied on intimidation, precision, and information. Every ally had a role, every rival a predetermined fate. He used the desert's isolation to test loyalty and execute plans without witnesses. His network functioned like a machine, each part feeding the whole, and any disruption was met with swift, brutal correction. Communities near his routes lived under an invisible shadow, never knowing when or where the next attack would strike. What set the Desert Reaper apart was his psychological control. The carved symbols at crime scenes were more than threats. They were tools of terror, a message that he was watching, waiting, and inevitable. Stories of his cruelty spread quickly, deterring resistance before it even began. Those who survived his attacks often became his unwilling informants, helping him maintain power while spreading fear. Law enforcement, frustrated by their inability to anticipate his moves, began to view him as untouchable, a man who understood the desert and human nature in equal measure. By the time his influence reached across borders, it was clear that the Desert Reaper was more than a gangster. He was a force of nature. He demonstrated that terror could be orchestrated with strategy, that violence could be precise, and that a criminal empire could rise in the vastest emptiness, invisible until it was too late. And yet, despite his dominance, his story was far from over. Each move, each strike, only set the stage for greater challenges, as law enforcement and rival gangs alike realized that they were dealing with a mind that was always impossibly one step ahead. On the sun-drenched streets of California, a new kind of criminal empire was quietly rising. Known as the Pacific Kingpin, he was unlike the gangsters of New York, Chicago, or the deserts of Arizona. His power came not from street-level violence alone, but from his mastery of technology, cybercrime, and calculated intimidation. He understood that the modern world offered tools far deadlier than guns, information, manipulation, and anonymity. From his sleek offices and hidden lairs, he orchestrated an empire that spanned cities, states, and even countries, striking silently, efficiently, and invisibly. His rise began in the shadows of Silicon Valley, exploiting digital networks and online systems that most law enforcement agencies barely understood. While others relied on brute force, he used cyber infiltration to control businesses, manipulate markets, and gather intelligence. Every hack, every leak was executed with precision, leaving his targets powerless and unaware of who was truly behind their misfortune. In a world where evidence could be traced, he left none, moving like a ghost through firewalls, servers, and encrypted networks. Yet the Pacific Kingpin was not solely a digital phantom. He combined his technological expertise with traditional criminal operations, creating a hybrid empire that was both physical and virtual. Drug trafficking, money laundering, and smuggling were coordinated through online channels, ensuring minimal exposure. Even rival gangs feared crossing him, knowing that a misstep could result not in a violent ambush, but in financial ruin, loss of influence, or public exposure. He had learned that control could be more effective when invisible, striking fear without ever showing his face. Investigators began noticing strange patterns. Entire criminal networks collapsing seemingly overnight, unexplained betrayals, and impossible financial movements. Despite his meticulous planning, the Pacific Kingpin was unpredictable, keeping authorities and rivals on edge. His genius lay in combining technology, fear, and strategy, proving that the most dangerous criminals in the modern era were those who could manipulate systems, information, and people simultaneously. Across California and the Pacific coast, he had established a silent reign of terror, one that left communities unaware of the full scope of his influence until it was far too late. He had become a new breed of criminal, invisible, intelligent, and unstoppable, a reminder that power in the modern world could thrive without blood spilled in the streets, yet still command fear in ways the world had never seen before. In the quiet, sprawling towns of Kansas and Missouri, a different kind of menace quietly rose to power. He became known as the Heartland Butcher, a name whispered with fear in communities that once believed themselves safe from the chaos of big cities. Unlike gangsters in crowded metropolises, he thrived in isolation, using the open roads, empty fields, and small-town routines to his advantage. Violence was his tool, but it was measured, precise, and terrifyingly unpredictable. He understood the psychology of rural life, exploiting the sense of security that people took for granted and turning it into a weapon. His early crimes were almost invisible, masked by the ordinary rhythms of life. A truck stolen here, a business broken into there, minor acts that seemed isolated at first. But slowly, a pattern emerged. Each act was a warning, a demonstration of power designed to instill fear and control. The Heartland Butcher did not need a massive gang to dominate. He relied on fear, timing, and meticulous planning. Each crime scene was carefully orchestrated, leaving just enough evidence to ensure the terror lingered without revealing his identity. Communities became paranoid. People stopped traveling at night. Gas stations, diners, and local stores, once bustling with life, became silent, tense, and anxious. The butcher seemed to appear anywhere, at any time, leaving no clues other than the devastation he caused. His methods were brutal, yet he avoided unnecessary risks. He preferred to strike when and where his victims least expected it, leaving both law enforcement and locals bewildered. Each act was a calculated reminder that he was always watching, always one step ahead. What made him particularly dangerous was his intelligence and planning. Unlike impulsive criminals, the Heartland Butcher studied his targets for weeks or even months. He mapped escape routes, anticipated responses from authorities, and observed the behavior of people who could help or hinder him. No ordinary lawman could easily predict his moves, and even seasoned investigators found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered. His ability to combine patience, precision, and psychological terror created an aura of invincibility. Yet, what truly distinguished the Heartland Butcher from other criminals was his understanding of human nature. He knew how fear could paralyze, how unpredictability could dominate minds, and how the silence of small towns amplified terror. By the time law enforcement began piecing together his operations, he had already moved on, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a community forever altered by the knowledge that a predator had walked among them undetected. The Heartland Butcher proved that danger could thrive not just in crowded streets, but in the open expanses of the countryside, where the quiet itself became an accomplice to terror. Up in the cold, snow-covered towns of Minnesota and the surrounding northern states, a new kind of criminal terror gripped the region. Known only as the Northern Nightmare, he was feared not for the chaos he created through brute force, but for the psychological grip he held over communities. Unlike gangsters who ruled through visible displays of violence, the Nightmare thrived in secrecy, using fear, intimidation, and subtle manipulation to control everything in his path. His victims often didn't know what hit them, and by the time the authorities realized the scope of his operations, it was far too late. He began quietly, targeting small businesses, families, and neighborhoods, leaving behind cryptic warnings rather than immediate violence. A broken window here, a missing shipment there, notes left in shadows. These small acts were enough to unsettle entire towns. People became wary of strangers, neighbors suspicious of one another, and communities silent and tense in a way that felt unnatural. The Northern Nightmare understood that fear could be more powerful than bullets, that the threat of harm often had a longer-lasting impact than harm itself. Over time, his operations grew more sophisticated. He built a network of spies and informants within communities, using unsuspecting individuals to relay information about movements, routines, and vulnerabilities. Children unknowingly carried messages, shopkeepers reported activities out of fear, and neighbors observed each other, all while thinking they were protecting themselves. The Nightmare turned entire towns into instruments of his power, creating an invisible web of surveillance and control that even law enforcement struggled to unravel. Despite the apparent chaos, his actions were highly calculated. He avoided unnecessary confrontation, preferring manipulation over open violence. His attacks were precise, targeted, and designed to maximize fear. Rival gangs or anyone attempting to challenge him quickly discovered that they were not just facing a man, but a force that anticipated their every move. Each threat was layered, each act of intimidation a psychological trap, leaving victims paralyzed by uncertainty and dread. Authorities eventually noticed a disturbing pattern. Communities where he operated exhibited strange levels of compliance and suspicion, as if his influence extended beyond the physical realm. Investigators discovered that the Northern Nightmare had a unique talent for controlling perception, making ordinary events seem threatening and ordinary people seem suspicious. The power of his empire lay in this invisible dominance, a reign built on paranoia, misinformation, and psychological manipulation rather than traditional violence. What made him particularly terrifying was the unpredictability of his moves. He could vanish for months, only to strike with calculated intensity, leaving authorities scrambling for answers. Unlike other criminals whose actions could be traced, the Nightmare's influence was subtle, pervasive, and almost impossible to anticipate. Communities under his control became isolated, their normal routines disrupted by the constant fear that the unseen predator was always watching. By the time law enforcement pieced together the full scope of his operations, the Northern Nightmare had already embedded himself into multiple towns, controlling not only criminal activity, but also the perception of safety itself. He proved that terror could be wielded without overt violence, that power could come from the unseen, and that the most dangerous criminals were often those who could manipulate minds as skillfully as they manipulated events. His reign of psychological terror left communities forever changed, their sense of security shattered, and their understanding of danger permanently altered. As the stories of the deadliest gangsters unfolded across the United States, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Each criminal, from the Shadow King of New York to the Northern Nightmare of Minnesota, appeared to operate independently, yet the evidence suggested something far more sinister. Law enforcement agencies pieced together fragments of intelligence, only to realize that these seemingly separate empires were connected in a hidden network that spanned the entire country. The web of influence was vast, intricate, and nearly impossible to trace, hinting at a level of planning and coordination that defied belief. Investigators discovered that each gangster played a distinct role in this underground alliance. Some controlled the streets with brute force, while others manipulated markets, technology, or information. Territories overlapped, yet conflicts were carefully orchestrated to benefit a larger design. Resources were shared in secret, intelligence passed discreetly, and even rivalries were sometimes staged to eliminate weaker players. It was a criminal machine, with each member a cog, and yet, at the center, an unseen force seemed to pull the strings. The deeper authorities dug, the more complex the connections became. Communications were hidden in coded messages, financial transfers masked by layers of shell companies, and movements cloaked in anonymity. Surveillance footage, informant testimonies, and recovered ledgers revealed traces of collaboration. One gangster's heist funded another's operations hundreds of miles away. One's disappearance coincided with the rise of another. Hints of coordination appeared in ways too precise to be coincidence. It became clear that these criminals were not merely competing, they were part of a master plan, a nationwide syndicate operating under an unspoken code. And then came the most shocking revelation. A surviving gangster, previously assumed to be just one of the many players, had been manipulating the entire network from the shadows. Every alliance, every betrayal, every violent act had been carefully orchestrated to consolidate ultimate power. While the other gangsters believed they were acting independently, they had unknowingly played into his strategy, eliminating threats, expanding territories, and destabilizing rivals. The scope of his influence was staggering. He had created a criminal empire that extended across states, uniting chaos with precision, violence with cunning, and fear with intelligence. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, his identity remained a mystery. Investigators could trace patterns, anticipate moves, and predict outcomes, but the man himself remained invisible, untouchable, and always one step ahead. It was as if the empire existed not in one place, but everywhere, its mastermind untethered by geography, law, or logic. Communities across the country were unknowingly caught in a game they did not understand, while the hidden strategist quietly tightened his grip. The conclusion of this sprawling criminal saga left a haunting question. Who was truly the deadliest gangster in the United States? Was it the Shadow King, the Midwest Marauder, the Southern Phantom, or one of the other notorious figures whose names inspired fear? Or was it the unseen mastermind who had orchestrated every move, controlled every outcome, and remained invisible to the world? In the end, the answer was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The deadliest gangster was not a single man, but the orchestrator of all, a shadow whose reach extended into every state, whose power transcended violence, and whose story was far from over. The network he had created was a reminder that in the world of crime, the greatest danger often lies not in what you can see, but in what lurks unseen, waiting, planning, and always winning.